Welcome to Washington Unplugged. I'm Sharyl Attkisson. President Obama focused most of his State of the Union address last night on domestic policy and jobs without outlining his goals on foreign policy. Joining us today, a team of national security experts to talk about terrorism issues the president faces in his second year in office. Patrick Cronin is a senior advisor at the Center for New American Security. Juan Zarate is CBS News national security consultant, and Dana Priest is an investigative reporter for the Washington Post. Thanks for joining us.
Pleasure.
Pat, before our first question, just briefly tell us what your group's all about.
Well, the Center for New American Security was set up 3 years ago by Kurt Campbell and Michelle Flournoy, now both senior officials in the Obama administration, but it was to capture the pragmatic center on national security policy. The two heads of the center right now are experts on counterinsurgency, John Nagel and Nate Fick. They've both written best-selling books on Afghanistan and counterinsurgency.
So you know a lot about this first topic, which is administration officials have floated the idea of perhaps working with the Taliban, who I think most Americans have seen for a long time as mortal enemies, in trying to combat al-Qaeda. We haven't heard a whole lot of specifics, but what's your reaction to that idea?
Well, it's not a new idea. In fact, it was broached early on with the administration last year, but that was a point of weakness. The United States was still reassessing whether we were going to have more troops on the ground or not. Now that we've committed to a new Afghan policy, if not strategy, with more troops on the ground, we're in a relatively strong position to at least talk about the tactic of reaching out to some members of the Taliban. That is, we can distinguish between the rank and file on the one hand, the bottom up, versus the leadership.
Which way do you go with this?
Well, I think the safer bet is you are trying to peel off some of the rank and file. You're trying to at least go into some of the tribal areas and hopefully say, listen, this is not worth the candle. You really don't want to take on an increased projected power force on the ground. You want to get away from this conflict. In fact, we'll even find you some jobs. The government will work with you. But if you're talking about negotiating with Mullah Omar and the leadership of the Taliban or other leaders, then you're talking about what kind of conditions you would accept this. What kind of influence does the United States have? What kind of staying power do we have? Who's doing the negotiation? Is it the Karzai regime? What's the role of the Pakistanis? There are a lot of questions about the leadership.
Juan, what I think a lot of Americans worry about is there's an opinion held out there by probably people you know that we as Americans don't understand the foreign cultures the way we should, or the enemy the way they may understand us. Why should we negotiate or even talk with lower members or upper members of the Taliban? Can we trust what they say? Are they really going to do the things if they tell us they're going to do? Or are they going to be playing both ends against the middle? What do you think?
Well, it's a good question, and as Patrick indicates, this isn't a new concept. Even in the Bush administration, there were discussions with the Karzai regime about what a long-term political solution looks like in Afghanistan, one in which you have to deal with the tribal players, you have to deal with elements of the Taliban. And I think one thing for the American public to keep in mind is that the Taliban is not one homogenous group. There are different fractures within the Taliban, different elements and layers. You've got the Afghan Taliban, the Pakistan Taliban, different interests among them. And so I think this discussion comes at a time when we're trying to find what is the long-term political solution in Afghanistan so that the U.S. can get out, so that we can see a long-term solution for security and politics. At the same time, you have Stan McChrystal and David Petraeus talking about a counterinsurgency strategy which relies on finding local allies, which may be peeling off some Taliban members or some former allies of the Taliban, so that you've got this political dynamic at the grand scale in Kabul, as well as this field-based desire to try to peel off Taliban support and membership. And I think that's why you're seeing more and more discussion about dealing with the Taliban.
Just briefly, is it fair to say that you both are more hesitant about the idea of having high-level talks with Taliban officials, or rather than peeling off the lower levels?
I think you can do both. But I don't think you necessarily go to Mullah Omar first. I think you go to elements of Taliban leadership that have expressed an interest to be part of a long-term engagement with the Afghan government.
Pat?
I think that's right. There are multiple layers, so you don't go to the very top. And you certainly have to be thinking about the long-term political context in which you have an exit strategy. And this is not new. The Bush administration has been exploring it, thinking about it. The Obama administration has to think about it. And so ultimately, you are dealing with people who are considered to have been allied with the leadership of the Taliban in some kind of political framework. What does that look like? But in the short term, it's this counterinsurgency. We're increasing the troops on the ground, increased fighting. That's when we have to peel off right now in some tribal areas some of the rank and file and try to reduce the threat, reduce the problem.
One observer told me he was afraid this sends a couple of signals that could be bad. I want to get your opinion on that. Number one, that if you're willing to work with Taliban, folks who have allied with al-Qaeda, again, talking about mortal enemies, what signal does that send to others who might be trying to harm the United States? And secondly, well, let me get your answer to that first, and then I'll do point two, Pat.
Well, not everybody in the Taliban has been working with al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda has taken advantage of Taliban sort of pleasure of having them locally there, but the reality is that the Taliban is this broad umbrella. And when we call Taliban, they aren't wearing a card saying, I'm a member of the Taliban. These are mostly local tribes, who many Pashtuns, and they've aligned in some ways against the foreign intervention and against the central government in Kabul. But we can negotiate and try to provide incentives for them to peel off of this support of fighting the government and fighting the U.S.-led coalition. And that's really irrespective of whether they ever allied with any al-Qaeda causes or not. We're not talking about negotiating with al-Qaeda, though.
I think Patrick's earlier point is a good one, which is the context of this discussion about talking to the Taliban matters. Are we doing it from a position of strength, or is it a perceived position of weakness from which then the Taliban can take advantage? And I think one of the advantages of having the president stand up and stand behind a surge, having troops in areas that the Taliban used to hold, like Helmand province and some of the valleys there in the south, that gives us a much better position in which to have these discussions and to not have it be a discussion from a position of weakness.
Well, concern number two, which I was about to bring up, which you can address, is does it make it look, even though we all know that the United States doesn't wish to be in Afghanistan and doesn't wish to be there forever, but does floating this idea now with the president's support flag that we really want to get out, we're looking to exit, not win, and could that be a weakness for us?
I think messaging in particular to our allies in both Afghanistan and in Pakistan in particular is very tricky here. And I think this was part of the debate about our Afghan strategy and whether or not the debate that played out in the newspapers and in the Situation Room really did damage at the end of the day to cause questions as to whether or not we have the staying power in the region. So I think any of this has to keep in mind the demonstration effect in particular in Pakistan, as to whether or not the Pakistanis who have to fight the Pakistan Taliban in Western Pakistan, whether or not they think we're there for the long haul. And right now, I think they're questioning that. And I think we've got to be very careful in terms of maneuvering with the Taliban and with the Afghan government to not send the wrong signals.
All right, let's bring in Dana Priest. Yesterday, you reported that U.S. Special Ops have been involved in operations in Yemen. Most of us really didn't know. Can you sort of synopsize what you found and the importance of that?
Well, this is a conversation that started about 6 months ago when U.S. intelligence and military officials really did become quite concerned that an affiliate of al-Qaeda called al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula had become the new Afghanistan almost, that they were seeing the collection of various disparate al-Qaeda followers there and mounting or preparing to mount operations which they thought were only in Yemen, but which we saw on Christmas Day were really actually aimed at the United States. And about 6 months ago, the president there asked the U.S. To begin a more serious dialogue. And what happened, fast forward till now, up until now, they have sent about 3 dozen Special Operations Forces. These are the most elite of our troops. They're called the Joint Special Operations Command. And they are not only training, but they are also preparing raids that the Yemeni troops that they have trained carry out. Our American soldiers don't go with them on the raids, but they do everything short of that. They do the planning. They create intelligence using hundreds of people that are back in the United States throughout the intelligence community who are helping them to find al-Qaeda leaders and to figure out how to kill or capture them. So far, we understand that they have killed about 6 of the 15 top leaders of that al-Qaeda affiliate. This is a sensitive operation in Yemen because much of the population is very suspicious of what the United States is going to do. In fact, after 9/11, I remember reporting back then that they thought they were next on the list because they were the ancestral home of Osama bin Laden. So this is a very sensitive operation. The president there has put definite lines of demarcation where the United States is not supposed to put, quote unquote, boots on the ground. But they are helping them in ground raids. They're also helping them to do air raids using fixed-wing aircraft. In other words, not the Predator unmanned drones that have been so effective elsewhere. And so far, I think they've carried out about 24 raids, mostly very successful.
Does Yemen risk, do you think, becoming another Pakistan and Afghanistan for the United States? And by that I mean an area that's so important that we keep having to get more and more of a foothold there, and we're continuing to spread ourselves around?
Well, that's certainly the potential. I don't think it's quite up to that point yet, but it has this collection now that they're very concerned about. And as we saw from the Christmas Day bombing, they are not just looking inward. This was the big revelation from that incident, was that all intelligence was very keenly aware that something was going on, some plotting and planning was going on against U.S. and European interests, but they thought it was within Yemen borders, and lo and behold, it was not. It was aimed much more directly at the United States, and that's only increased the concern that the sort of sophisticated planning and development of an operation is going on inside of Yemen. And that's given them much more resolve to keep this up and increase, in fact. And that's part of what they're talking about in London today, increasing not only development aid, but also military aid. We give them a lot in terms of munitions, money, equipment, and training.
Dana mentioned the Christmas Day bombing. Osama bin Laden belatedly claimed credit for the failed attempt, which I'm not sure is really the best thing to do. As we tried to do something really big and failed. But in our final moments, I want to get a number on a scale of 1 to 10 from each of you. How important Osama bin Laden is? How relevant is he today compared to, being public enemy number 1 a few years back? And if you want to give a sentence or two as to why you think that, go ahead.
I'm not sure I'll give you a number, but he is still incredibly important, both symbolically and from a strategic perspective. He views himself, and many in the world view Al-Qaeda and bin Laden as the centers, the hub of this global terrorist movement.
All right, that's an 8.
I'll give it a 5. Al-Qaeda is in decline, but not terrorism per se. And I'm influenced by the writing of my wife, Audrey Cronin, whose book How Terrorism Ends talks about how terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda indeed meet their demise. It's meeting its demise as long as we don't perpetuate it. And we have to be very careful not to expand what are these local insurgencies and conflating all of the terrorist acts into one big Al-Qaeda operation. It's not all Al-Qaeda run. It's just inspired.
Okay. Thanks to Dana Priest and to you, Patrick Cronin, and also Juan Zarate, our expert here at CBS. Thanks for watching Washington Unplugged, and make sure to watch my Follow the Money reports and investigations on the CBS Evening News with Katie Couric. I'm Sharyl Attkisson. Have a great day.